time. Do you see me now?
No, sir.
Okay, let's go on without it and not worry about it. My name is Dr. John Landsberger. John would be great for everybody to announce me by, if they want to ask a question. Let me give you a little bit about my credentials and why, because most of you have not met me in the past. I'm a urological oncologist and a radiation oncologist by profession. I retired a number of years ago. When COVID came out, which is for me now over two and a couple of months ago, because in October, November of 2020, I started reading cases of Omicron in China and became concerned that this was going to become a problem for us all to face. I apologize for that. I'm silencing my phone now. By coincidence, even though I started reading a lot, voraciously a lot actually about COVID, I actually ended up being the very first physician in Southern California to hospitalize a major case of COVID here in Los Angeles. Just to give you an idea of the history of this disease, the really way it came to America was that if you remember, it came from China. It really went to northern Italy as the pandemic extended, and then ended up coming from Italy to New York and to Los Angeles. In that first group of people that came from Italy, there were 13 skiers of all different age groups, and all of them became infected. They came through customs without any restrictions. They were tested by the public health department. The outcomes are one guy never got out of Europe and unfortunately died. The second gentleman that I took care of was 68 days in a hospital on a respirator, requiring dialysis support also, has done extremely well, although he lost his fingers as a consequence of the pressors. The other two gentlemen that were hospitalized were on ventilators for very short periods of time. I think one didn't even require ventilation, just medical support for a few days. And the eldest of that group, the 86-year-old, went through it with a very mild disease. This is a slide from one of our first discussions, and it was data, and that still remains true today. More and more data. I'm hitting next slide and it's not doing anything. Can you, so do you see the next slide? I don't know where can you do the next slide for me or because I see to the side. There you go. Okay, so we're going to go through a little bit of just an idea of what's happening in terms of numbers and cases and deaths and what's happening in the world as a whole. Most of these slides come from resources today that are very robust, where you can change the parameters in them very easily, look at whatever data you want. I told Brees, I sent him all the links. If you're interested in delving into something where you're going to travel to, or what's happening in those particular areas, what vaccine they got, how effective it was, what's happening, it's a great source because these websites are just totally interactive, and you can find out virtually anything where you want. What I want to point out here, this is the world, and we're going to get to California in a second, but we look at North America and we are the inventors of really the most successful vaccines for COVID, and yet Western Europe is clearly well better vaccinated than we are, but more importantly, we look at the progression, and even into modern time, we see this still. These are the total number of cases in light blue, and the deaths are still high. I mean, we haven't changed that number. I know you hear on the television that less people are dying, and we'll get into that in just a second and why we think that's happening and what do we think the future brings for us. The next slide would be great. going through a lot of slides with statistics, and then we're really going to just talk about really real life and what's happening. So if we can go to the fourth slide. It works for you. Okay. Okay. I'm going to try that next time. Okay. So this is once again what we saw, a representation really for I happen to use the United States in this case rather than, and particularly Los Angeles County, just to get a sense of what happened in America. We had this huge burst in really last year, lasting for 4 months with huge amounts of deaths. That was already the variant of Delta expressing itself, which was a variant of the original COVID identified that came out of Wuhan, China. It was a variant, but it was a variant that it was slightly more contagious and definitely more deadly. And we had this huge spike that went on. Today, as we see the trailing end, and I don't know if you can see my arrow, we still see that deaths have gone up. And this is a little concerning to me. And you're going to hear later some other authorities saying, they have all kinds of explanations for that. I'm a little worried about that is moving in the same directions, I'm hitting, okay, there I go. Well, what happened here? So did we go to the next slide or no, we didn't. So I'm going to ask you to do it because somehow it doesn't like to do it for me. I presented here and I give you the link to this. It's the number of vaccines that exist in the world. We have to go back to that vaccine one if you wouldn't mind. I wanted to just point out to you that there are 4 main types of vaccines and how they're made. We covered this in past materials, so I don't want to waste the time. If people are interested in watching this video, it goes through how vaccines are made, how they're different. We're all familiar with vaccines such as the polio vaccine, which came in both the live form and what's called live attenuated form, which is called whole virus. We have protein subunits, we have viral vectors, and then we have nucleic acids, which are RNAs and DNAs. And the ones that we are using in this country today, and I'm excluding Johnson & Johnson because, to be honest with you, I don't think if you have a choice at all, you should be taking Moderna or Pfizer. And Johnson & Johnson is great, but it really, it had some potential, and it even had some potential that we thought might be greater than the other two. But life has turned out that and as well as the AstraZeneca vaccines don't seem to be as good as the messenger RNA vaccines, which are the two that are the most common in this country. Pfizer, by a huge number, is the most popular in the world because they're a giant pharmaceutical company and can produce in very large numbers. They have dominated the market. Moderna is a much smaller company, can't produce as much. I think if you look at past history, Moderna was slightly better, but I mean slightly, and I wouldn't have differentiated if I was taking the vaccine one from the other. If you've been vaccinated and you're looking for a booster, the CDC says you can get boosted with anything. I would say stay within the same type that you had for certain other reasons that they're not discussing scientifically. I believe, like if you were with Pfizer before, stay with Pfizer. If you were with Moderna, stay with Moderna. If you were Johnson & Johnson, switch over. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to ask you to do that again because for some reason I don't have control of that. I hit that and nothing happens. Do you still hear me? There you go. Okay, so we're looking once again, we have this slow progression. I mean, it's just crawling of what I would call vaccine resistance, because we don't really see that people have really gone out there and been truly vaccinated across the world. I looked at, once again, this slide comes off of a database that you can look at that's very robust, and I think it's very important to look at the world, not just America, because if you look at the variants that have come, they didn't start in America. So you've got to get control of this disease worldwide, not just in America. We're not going to be able to sit on a boat by ourselves and be protected. Unless the world becomes protected, we're going to have a problem. And if you look down in the right-hand corner, on January 6th of this year, we have a tiny amount of people that got boosted. We have, across the world, we have about 38% of the people that got a fully vaccinated, what we consider 2 shots on every vaccine, including Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca, and at least 1 dose on a worldwide basis. 1 shot doesn't do you a whole lot of protection, but these are the numbers, and you really can't fight them. The next slide. I brought this in particular to make people aware of the concerns that we have in terms of what's going on now in terms of hospitalization and occupying hospital space. That's my largest concern. We're now in a Omicron variant, which our moderator very skillfully said is we believe is probably at least 10 times more contagious, but the morbidity, that's the ability to get really, truly sick, and the mortality, death rate, is significantly lower than we saw from the prior 2 variants. But if we look at hospitalizations and what's going on with the workforce at hospitalizations, you see these numbers over time, and you just see this huge escalation of people that are in the hospital. And I can tell you from talking to friends all over the country, hospitals are at a total strain. Nursing staff is out sick. Nursing staff has resigned. Nursing staff go to work for mobile nursing companies where they get paid a higher amount of money per hour, and are working at other institutions. I understand their motivations, but that makes hospitals run very inefficiently. There is a very big shortage. There is a strain on the system. So if you walk into the hospital today with a motor vehicle accident or a heart attack, you are at risk, just like somebody who has COVID, because the system is strained to the most it can manage in terms of patient management. It doesn't have enough staff in every capacity. I mean, it's just really overstrained. Okay, go to the next slide. And I think Bree's made it so we can actually play this 1-minute video. This is our CDC Director. I think she has something to say in a minute that I think is worthwhile hearing. Did it play? It didn't play, did it? He was supposed to do a link that it would play. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you what she said. Basically, more or less, she's trying to say the rising death rate that we see today, they feel that this is a lag phase to not Omicron, but really the Delta leftover in hospitals and Delta cases that are still remaining. Of the cases that are being admitted to the hospital today, we know that, and that's going to be on the next slide. Let's actually take it, and I'll talk about both at the same time. I tried to isolate out, and I yellowed it in this website also, which Breeze can give you the access to all these websites. You hit a United States normally with your dot, and everybody else becomes lighter. You get to see exactly where United States is. And you can see 96%, 97% of all cases that are being admitted today are Omicron. So we see that Delta is being pushed out, and Omicron is is kind of taking its place as the major receptor of infection. And I'd like to kind of talk about that. And so once again, the CDC director believes that the deaths that we see in hospitals still are the burnout of the old Delta cases. A lot of the cases have been there extremely long. I'm taking care of a patient right now that's been in the hospital over 5 months. He is on the respirator is nothing. He's on ECMO, he's on dialysis, and he's in real trouble. And the goal there is to stabilize him well enough to get a lung transplant. Otherwise, his chances of survival are virtually zero. But this still continues to be a problem. What do we mean that Omicron is wedging out Delta? And this is, I think, the concern that people need to think about very, very carefully. If you're 10 times to 100 times more infectious as vectors that have susceptibility come around, that means you have a family gathering and somebody's not vaccinated, or even in the case of Omicron, they're fully vaccinated. These vaccines were not designed for this variant. The fact that they keep people from getting deathly ill and dying is a benefit, but they were not designed for this. So don't view this as a failure of the vaccine. The vaccine was directed specifically for certain areas of the spike proteins on the COVID virus. They work very effectively against these mutations. The Omicron variant has over 36 mutations, many of them on the spike protein. It's expected that we're going to have breakthrough cases. You'll see in the next slide or two that the people that have been fully vaccinated, or the last slide actually, don't end up in the hospital. And the people that with Omicron that have not gotten vaccinated, they do end up in the hospital, but relatively for short periods of time and fare well. Does that mean everything's good? Omicron's going to take over. We're going to see a disappearance of Delta, and life is going to be good again. And I go, well, I have some severe doubts. So does Fauci. Fauci says that would be lovely, but I'm not certain that's going to be true. What happens in rapidly spreading viral diseases, they hit many of their hosts, and viruses are not live organisms. They can only live within the cell of a live organism, a host, a human being. If you start to use up the hosts and the hosts recover even from Omicron, do they maintain an immunity against Delta? Well, that's unclear at this point that they do. And more importantly, not only Delta, it gives an opportunity for further mutations that we may not have resistance to, that can then reinfect people that were either vaccinated or came down with natural immunity through Omicron or a Delta infection. Remember, vaccines have longer immunity responses than do infections, but both of them wane over time. That's why we're talking about boosters. That's why we're talking about a fourth booster. When they talk about a fourth booster, is it for Omicron? It is not. We know specifically the vaccines that we have out there are not very effective against Omicron. It's really to protect the society once Omicron kind of burns out, and it will burn out. You're seeing it already in New York. There's a 45% drop in Omicron cases, one of the first sites to get really overwhelmed. We're going to see that here in Southern California. We're going to see it worldwide. Very rapid infections, fast recovery, and that virus will basically disappear. We will see that virus strain disappear off the face of the earth, which will give the opportunity for other variants to possibly take hold. And that's an unknown. I'm speculating. I can't tell you whether that's true or not true. Neither can anybody else. It's just a feeling of what you get in terms of what these things tend to do over trends of life. If you go to the next slide, these are slightly out of order, unfortunately. That no, go back. That was supposed to be one of our first slides. The next one I'm saying. So this is current data, and we still see, when we look at this thing, the 7-day moving average, deaths from totally COVID, no matter what the cause, whether it's Omicron or Delta, we still see a very high number that we would rather not see in the United States. We still see that hospitals, I'll give you an example. Torrance Memorial is a small community hospital. It has 5 ECMO machines. ECMO machines are like dialysis machines for the lungs. Every single one of their machines is in operation. They don't have any more further reserve for additional COVID patients. They are at capacity and beyond capacity. And this is not unlike many other institutions. If you go to USC is not at capacity, but they're understaffed to the point they cannot take more patients in because they don't have the staff to maintain the care to the patient population that's being driven towards them. So it's a real problem. You go to look at Cedars-Sinai, in days prior to COVID, there was always a wait for an ICU room. There was always a wait for an admission to the hospital. And there usually was 20 to 30 people waiting for admission. Today, it's over 100 on a daily basis. The people are stuck in every hallway, every nook and cranny that they can think of, and it's understaffed and undermanaged, and it's bad. The next slide was a review I was going to do at the very beginning. You can go to number 11. This is what a virus is. It's a lipoprotein surrounded by, and what's inside is the nucleic acid. These things travel through the air in the case of the COVID virus, but we see viruses in a number of different patterns of spread. For instance, GI spread, and the most known one is polio. Polio is an oral fecal transmission. It's not aerosolized at all. It doesn't transmit in the air. This is a respiratory virus. Omicron is a word for crown. The reason it's called that is these little proteins on the tip look like a crown on them, and that's why it was named that way. But this is basically what viruses are. Once again, remembering they are not live structures. They depend on hosts. So human beings are the only vector at this point that can continue to spread this disease. The last slide is I included. We can go to the last slide, and then we're going to just have an open discussion of questions. This came from our very first lecture. And the question was, do we have an epidemic, which means do we have a local outbreak of a bad problem? Do we have a pandemic where it travels the world, or are we endemic? And I can now answer that question pretty easily and say we are an endemic situation. That means COVID is going to live with us for the years in the future. We're going to need to learn to manage to live with this disease as it evolves, as it changes, as it alters. There may come a time, and there are many companies working on this vigilantly, and they are going to come up with an answer, that there'll be a vaccine for not a particular strain of COVID, but for COVID altogether, which includes the common cold, right? The common cold is a COVID virus. It's a type, we adenoviruses, retroviruses. There's very different types of viruses that we have in our normal environment, and COVID is just COVID, or is just one type of that, and COVID, this COVID outbreak is a unique type of COVID that we hadn't seen prior. But it is the idea of COVID viruses existing in the environment and naturally in the environment was always true. I know the question's inevitably going to come up with is, where did this come from? Was this a natural transmission from animal to man? Was this a lab leak? I wish China would be more open to be honest. They know the answer for sure, because the people that worked at the laboratory, the containment laboratory, were all tested. And based upon their testing and their serology, we know whether there was an accidental release of this virus. I think that's most likely how it came. And this whole rumor that it jumped from animal to man probably is not the way it did it. I don't find there was a big scandal that China wasn't allowing the World Health Organization to come in and audit their files and do all kinds of things. I have to be honest, America wouldn't do it either. We're not open to let foreign countries come into our data, and it might have been more discoverable by the free press because of the Freedom of Information Act. We may have known that there was an accidental release, and it may have come out in our country easier, but I don't think the government would have necessarily disclosed it right away either. So I think is China, I don't like to use the word blame, as we have these laboratories that are necessary to store pathogenic materials of high risk. We take risks, just like with new generation of power with nuclear power plants. They're excellent resources for power, and they're necessary, but they are risky, and especially as they get aged and people get sloppy. Human errors happen. They're expected to happen. It's just how do you react to them and how bad is the outcome? But I'm not surprised. We've had in our own laboratories here in America, these incidences are reported. Are they probably underreported? I would say yes. And there are dozens of accidental releases of viruses within American laboratories as well that have been reported. So let's not throw the shoe at somebody quite right away. Then I want to leave a lot of time open for questions, which leaves us about 15 minutes for things that I didn't go over. So I open it to the audience at this point, or maybe to our host first to guide me to something that I didn't address that he wants specifically addressed.
Thank you very much, Doc. Yes, sir. Is it possible to test negative but still have COVID?
So that's really interesting, particularly with Omicron. So I have noticed in the patients, particularly that breakthrough infection in patients who were fully immunized, they tested negative for days. And particularly by PCR, which should be more sensitive than the antigen test. And then bang, their antigen test became positive, and then their PCR test became positive. So the answer to that is, it's not just a false negative, which is what we always talked about. I'm seeing it in much higher numbers than to say, we used to say the false positive rate on a PCR test, was 1 out of, 10,000 or something like that. I think that's no longer true. I think the sensitivity, although the test is extremely sensitive because we have enough natural immunity from either vaccination or exposure, that it's suppressing the number of viral particles, that the tests are not picking it up. So they are coming back negative and you are infected. So if you have a runny nose, a sore throat, a headache, I would suggest you isolate yourself at least for, get your test, wait at least 3 or 4 days and retest yourself. Because I've seen case after case after case of breakthrough infection that look just like that. And when I say that, I probably personally, and I'm not in active practice, have had 100 calls like that. And I'm not exaggerating, at least 100 calls. All those people did well. There's only one patient that had a pre-existing condition of diabetes that went on to a adjuvant therapy that was available for people in high-risk categories. We didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about therapies. There was supposed to be a slide here. Can we try to see if he's got it here somewhere? Because it seems to be missing on treatments. Once again, I'll have Bree circulate that. There's a New York Times table that comes out continuously and is updated on all the available treatments that are used for COVID-19, including ones that they don't believe work or are right. I'm sorry, I have to let the housekeeper in.
You gotta get that, Doc?
They list everything. They tell you the viability. It's an incredibly good website for lay knowledge to understand. There are now available over monoclonal antibodies. As you remember, the president received monoclonal antibodies when he got COVID. That particular one that was made by Merck, and there are 4 others that are similar to that, Merck and everybody else's, really don't work against Omicron, and the government doesn't recommend you even get them anymore. So even though they were developed and they had great promise, those drugs are now antiquated and sitting on the shelves and not being used. There is one that seems to work against Omicron. It's incredibly hard to get. I tried to find it for a patient. I went to a website, particularly for physicians. It was impossible to find in the state of California. It's in a huge rarity. It's given by infusion. It was not able to be found. There are now a number of oral drugs that are also available. Those are also very difficult to find. The ones that are particularly good for Omicron are virtually non-findable. There are some that are not any longer really recommended that you can find on rare occasions. They're hard to find. I looked it up on the table the other day. In all of Los Angeles County, there were 30 pharmacies that stocked it. I called a dozen of them for this patient and finally managed to find one pharmacy that had a dose. So it's nice to say that we have these things. The government's ordered hundreds of thousands of these, but they're not available. So it's great that we have them, but it's not almost worth talking about because they're not a viable treatment, correct? Remdesivir, let's talk about that. Everybody got remdesivir when they got hospitalized. That's gone too. Nobody's recommending remdesivir anymore for treatment of hospitalized patients and before they get on respirators. That was done in the hospital. The other thing I would caution people to know, just as lay people as they go see their physicians. I heard from a pharmacist that a lot of doctors were prescribing for Omicron low dose steroids, what we call Medrol dose pack for their cough and to make them feel better. That is not recommended by the CDC. and seems to be very counterintuitive to me and was distressing to me. When you are acutely infected with the virus, steroids will do nothing but suppress your immune system and possibly get you more ill. Steroids came to use when people were already progressing in their disease, in where we saw that they were going to be put on a respirator, usually day 7 to day 10. The virus had already been cleared. Their problem was then this whole cascade of the immune system. And that's where steroids in high doses were used very successfully, first introduced by me here in America, but by actually, truly, I'm kidding here. I suggested to a couple of hospitals because it's old school medicine, but the French proved in a study, they saved 60% of the patients by putting them on high dose steroids. But that's for very specific use, and should be reserved exclusively for hospitalized patients. So if somebody recommends you go on steroids, I would be very leery. I saw somebody had a comment about a vaccine. It came and disappeared. I couldn't read it fast enough.
Doc, it seems that a lot of the recent outbreaks with the Omicron, doesn't matter if you're vaccinated or not. It seems to be the case where if you are vaccinated, the symptoms are milder. Can you speak a little bit to that? And in terms of Omicron, does it make a difference if you're vaccinated or not?
Okay, so we actually, one of the slides covered that. We can go back, but I don't think we need to. I think we can just talk about it. None of the vaccines were designed for Omicron, but you see Omicron does have hospitalizations. They tend to be very short and people are released. But if you look at the hospitalization rates in people that were vaccinated, they're extremely, extremely low. And if you look at unvaccinated people, they're not so low. They're significantly higher. So is there a difference? Is there some protection against serious disease by getting vaccinated? The answer to that is an unequivocal yes. And should we go get vaccinated? Yes, we should, because it prohibits the overuse and the need for hospitalization, which is critical. I mean, imagine one of your loved ones today has a heart attack. Honestly, they're at risk going to the hospital today because the hospital is understaffed, and that's a critical problem. And you don't want to end up in a hospital for, and many surgeries are being postponed all over the country. A friend of mine was supposed to just have a total knee in New York, and he got postponed by 6 weeks. They just don't have the staff to do it. I mean, they have the ability to do it. They have the equipment. They have everything else. They're just understaffed and they can't do it. So I think vaccination still plays a role. And more importantly, as Omicron disappears and something replaces it, we don't know whether our present vaccine is going to be protective or not. We can assume it's going to have some protection. And if Delta comes back or resurges, which it can stay hidden on the sides, Omicron dies off, and then the rest of the vectors that have not been infected or that have lost their immunity start to get infected again with Delta. So we could watch this curve of Delta start to rise again 6 months from now. I'm not saying tomorrow, but 6 months from now, we can see, I could envision a time where Delta starts to rise again and come and reappear. And that would be a crime if we got this far along, got it this suppressed, and we couldn't maintain that suppression.
Doc, how effective is the vaccine 6 months after the last dose?
So these vaccines are not lifetime immunity like we get from smallpox, from polio, from many of the vaccines that we get in life have lifetime immunity. You get vaccinated once in your life and you're done. Other ones that we know of tetanus, we have to get re-immunized every 5 years. I know this seems, ridiculous. We're getting revaccinated every, 3 months, 6 months. The first two were really intended to be together, so that's one. Will we require boosters or additional vaccines that are even unique in the future? I say the answer is yes. We know the natural immunity from infection is short-lived. What is predicted to be short-lived? Around 3 months. So if you get infected with Delta and you've recovered from Delta, your immunity or your circulating antibodies, and this is where it gets a little confusing in terms of understanding what is immunity and what is not immunity. We measure immunity by what are called circulating antibodies, antibodies that are going around and are visible. The way we measure these are by what's called titration. They're difficult tests to do, they're expensive to do, and we don't really have a standard yet. We don't know what dilutional number is protected and what dilutional number is unprotected. That number is unknown. I'm part of a study, and I welcome you all to join it. They're looking for 100,000 people of any class, whether you've been vaccinated, not vaccinated, infected, not infected, whatever. They're trying to enroll 100,000 people to come in at their convenience periodically and get those titrations done free of charge. Cedars-Sinai is running this study out of multiple centers to look at and try to predict what happens to these people. What is the number that gives protection? What is the number that doesn't give protection? There are different labs that run these kind of quantitative. I have a friend that was told by her doctor, don't get the booster, you have plenty of circulating antibodies. And I said, let me see your lab results. And because I'm saying I'd be very curious to see how he's determining that. And she sent me her lab results from 2 different labs. And I said, show me where it says you have lots of circulating antibodies. It says they're present, but it doesn't give you a normogram. A normogram is a little curve of where everybody falls that has been subjected to a little thing. We don't know whether her number is high or low. And I said, your doctor doesn't misinterpreted what this says. It just says they're present. It doesn't mean that they're particularly high and they're particularly low. I'll give you some examples from my family. We're all part of the study. My wife's circulating antibodies by their titration method are 26,000. Her sisters are like 22,000. Somebody else was 16,000. Mine are 8,000. Does that mean I am unprotected? No, it doesn't mean that. It means we don't know what that number means. I'm not running off to get another booster. I'm just saying, well, she got a very robust immune response. That's great, but it doesn't say that I'm not protected. The second component of protection are what are called the T and B cells in our body. These are cells that remember disease. And when we get re-exposed to disease, they crank out antibodies very rapidly. And we don't understand yet how much memory is left in those T and B cells to respond to new infection. So I know this doesn't answer your question, but the science is actually moving extremely fast. I mean, I know it seems like it's 2 years. Oh my God, why don't we have the answer? Well, 2 years in science is really fast. And I think actually we've made incredible strides. In private industry is mainly responsible for most of those strides. I will remind you, in the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the CDC was tasked with coming up with a test to measure whether you were infected with COVID or not, and dismally failed. After 4 to 6 months, it was given up and it was given to industry. And within days, industry came up with tests that work to detect whether the PCR test, whether COVID was present or not. So, I know they're greedy bastards. They are greedy bastards. I don't always support big pharma, but big pharma has done a tremendous job of responding to this disease and has been very inventive, and we've progressed science tremendously. I'm going to go back to the oral medications, and I want you to remember what those oral medications are like. They're like Tamiflu. I don't know how many of you have ever taken Tamiflu for the flu, where you have to take it within 3 days of symptoms. I've never seen, I have Tamiflu sitting in my side drawer at my nightstand. I've never been able to, time it well. And I think those are hard things to do. By the time you realize you're sick, you're probably too far along to rely on those kind of drugs. But those drugs are going to get better. They're going to work more efficiently. They're going to help the body protect us better. There are drugs that are being developed to prevent even the absorption of the nasal sprays that are going to prevent the absorption of the virus, because it's a respiratory virus, from ever entering into the and kind of laying hold. I mean, there's all kinds of thoughts and some will work, some will die miserably on the vine. Tremendous amounts of dollars, investigative dollars, are spent on this, and there will be results, and there will be, I am convinced, a vaccine eventually for all COVID viruses, a more global one. Maybe not every single one, maybe not the common cold, but a great deal of these, and surely COVID-19 as a whole. Will we come up with a vaccine that will cover most mutations? I think that will happen over time. To have discovered a vaccine and bring it to market in as rapid a time as Pfizer and Moderna did. Remember, most of the time that you didn't see it, so the history is that Pfizer, Pfizer and Moderna basically were on the rush for the first messenger RNAs. Moderna picked its segment of the messenger RNA that they were going to incorporate into the portion of the spike protein in 3 days. And then they went to manufacture at their own risk, on their own dollars, later to get government dollars in warp speed. Pfizer did the same thing in almost as quickly, not quite as quickly, but never took even the warp speed dollars, and came up with a very good vaccine very quickly. There's extremely bright people that are working very hard, very diligently. I'm a little offended when I hear a lot about the giant big pharma conspiracy, and this is a way to sell drugs. I don't think that's the intent in this case. I'm not a big defender of big pharma. I think they're way too expensive. I think, private industry has truly driven the advance of these things, and will continue as we go into other discoveries in medicine, which the next major breakthrough in medicine is biologics. You've all heard of these now. They're used in ulcerative colitis. They're used in small cell cancer of the lung. They're used in certain uterine cancers. These are things that change the biological activity within the body to fight off disease. This is the new forefront. These drugs are all billion-dollar sellers because a monthly treatment is $30,000, but the cost of development is astronomical, and those drugs can only be developed in industry. And we just need to make decisions. Is that where we want to spend our healthcare dollars or not? That's a more social decision than a science decision.
For sure.
Getting off track
Well, hey,
here.
Doc, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank you on behalf of the Southern California PGA and the Education Committee for the section. Thank you so much for taking the time and share your expertise. For all the PGA members that have joined us this morning on the Catalyst, thank you very much for your support today. We're going to wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Doc, for your time. Everybody have a great day. Stay safe, stay sane out there.
Okay. And last mention, you should still use some precautions when you're out in large public gatherings. Okay.
Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Thank you. I know you can't see me, but thank you everybody for attending.